everyone, and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in Greenville, South Carolina, and you can find all of my contact information in the show notes if you need to reach out to me for any of your local real estate needs. And just a reminder, as always, there's only really one thing I ask that you guys do if you're a listener of the show or a watcher of the show on YouTube, is that you just hit that little like button, right? YouTube has it very easy to hit. It's a thumbs up button. If you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or some other platforms, you can leave a review, leave a rating, and all of those things I would appreciate. If you leave a comment too, I would try to monitor those and I will respond. That's mainly on YouTube. So please do that. And I would really appreciate it. So, excuse me. Sorry about that. We have a lot going on in state and the state of South Carolina and U.S. federal politics that are both influencing real estate and also have the potential to influence real estate. So we're going to be talking about the war in Iran and the impact that is already having. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But first I want to talk about state level politics. So I was in Columbia last week. There was a realtor conference, what we call realtor legislative meetings. We have a similar conference in DC that happens in June, but we had one on the state level in South Carolina just this past week here in March. And great conference. South Carolina Association of Realtors really did a good job with it. But there's one thing in particular that I want to highlight from this conference that I think you guys will find interesting, particularly if you are someone invested in our local political scene. And that is, we had a gubernatorial forum where we had 4 candidates running for governor that were interviewed for about 15 minutes each. And then there was a 5th, Nancy Mace, who couldn't make it, but she sent in a video, which I did not watch because I had to use the restroom during that time. But I heard that there really wasn't a whole lot substantial that came out of that video. But regardless, I want to discuss the 4 people that I did get to hear, and just kind of give you from the standpoint of Greenville real estate and all of the show, even though we're going to be talking about some bigger topics than just Greenville real estate. Everything about this, you need to think about it through a Greenville real estate lens, because that's the lens that I'm coming at it from. But we heard from the Lieutenant Governor Pamela Yvette, I believe is how you pronounce her last name, from Jermaine Johnson, who's currently, I believe, in our state house, if I'm not mistaken. Ralph Norman, who is a U.S. congressman, currently in the state of South Carolina. And Alan Wilson, who is the Attorney General in South Carolina currently. So it's a good group. 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat, Jermaine Johnson being the only Democrat. And I'll just lead with this. Jermaine Johnson is not going to win, right? We are not, it's the state of South Carolina, regardless of whether it should. I'm not here to choose winners and losers. South Carolina is very, very red right now politically, and there is simply not a chance in the world that a Democrat gets elected as governor, given the current state of the state. But that being said, it's helpful to hear from people on the other side of the aisle, right? Even though, we know that the election is going to be decided at the Republican primary stage, it's still good to hear what talking points Democrats are using. And ultimately, there's a reason why I always want to see people running against even a shoe-in favorite. And that's because, A, we don't want shoo-ins in any of our elections, including county council, city council. We want these to all be competitive to bring out the best in people. We don't want anyone to cakewalk into office, particularly not for governor, right? And so even though I'm very confident that Jermaine Johnson is not going to win, come I guess November is when the election is, the general election. I still think it's important that we know, some of his talking points, and then that will hopefully improve the talking points from whoever it is that wins the Republican primary, right? Assuming that Mr. Johnson does win the Democrat primary, which I'm not certain he's going to. But anyway, without much ado, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in here because I'm kind of rambling. Miss Yvette, Lieutenant Governor Yvette, I believe she was the first one that came out. I believe that she's probably the favorite. And to me, she is, whatever a change candidate is, she is the opposite of that. She is the candidate, in my opinion, that you elect if you kind of want a continuation of Governor McMaster's, current policies, right? As it is, she has served as his lieutenant governor, I believe, the entire time that he's been in office. I'd have to go back and check that. But as far as I know, she has. And not surprisingly, she did not offer a ton of changes from the current administration in Columbia. She and I think if you're looking for a change candidate, she would not be the one. Like, if you're not happy with the state of South Carolina right now, I don't think that she's the one that you want to talk to or that you want to vote for. That being said, everyone I talk to seems to really like her. And for most people, she was either their first option or second option. I spoke to several people after this forum was done, just out of curiosity, like, who did you like? Who were you impressed with? Most people said she was their number one or number two. And so she talked about a few things. All these candidates talked about housing affordability, infrastructure, impact fees, and insurance reform. And with regard to Miss Yvette, what she said is that with regard to housing affordability, she's focused on cutting permitting times and regulations. She's focused on educating children to stay out of debt so that they can afford something when they graduate. And I think that this is important. She wants to keep growing the state of South Carolina. And I say that that's important because that's actually a controversial talking point. Now, in theory, it's not controversial, right? Everyone says, oh, yes, we need to keep growing as a state. But when the rubber meets the road of what growing the state actually means, which means building more housing and having more of a population, more wear and tear on the roads, that's when people start to say, well, no, we need to keep people out of the state, and then, you'll hear people play both sides when it comes to growth. She specifically said we need to keep growing the state. I wrote that down as a quote. And so I find that interesting. With regard to infrastructure, the Department of Transportation, right, was a big talking point, right? We've got all these issues with our roads. She believes that we can fix this with bringing more technology to the DOT. I'm not sure I agree with her on that, but she said that. She also said we need a state master plan that we don't currently have. I fully agree with her on that. We definitely need that. Other than that, didn't hear a whole lot of specifics with regard to how she would reform the DOT, which was a little bit disappointing for me. We talked about impact fees. Impact fees are fees that a state or a local government will impose on a developer when they are subdividing out for a new subdivision, and it's something that it's a fee that you pay on each lot. It's basically a tax. And the Realtor Association's against impact fees because those fees get passed down to the end buyer ultimately, and they're much more expensive. If it's a $5,000 impact fee from the government to the builder, by the time it gets passed down to the end buyer, the home purchaser, that fee has been marked up by multiple agencies now to the point where it's like $15,000 to $20,000. That makes a big difference. If you're not a realtor, you might not realize that a lot of people are like right on the cusp of being able to afford the home that they want. And sometimes that extra $15,000 to $20,000 is the difference between whether they can or can't afford, the home that they really need. And so with regard to impact fees, she really didn't answer exactly how she would handle them, but she did express that she understood that those impact fees do get ultimately passed along to the end buyer. So she understands, which is important. That's an important part of it. A lot of people just are in denial, particularly on our local, and county level. There's a bit of denial that impact fees do get passed down to the end buyer. She understands that. She understands that builders have a lot of costs too. What she'll do about that, she left a lot to be desired for that. With regard to insurance, she didn't have a whole lot of ideas there. She just said that she would have the power to appoint the insurance commissioner, which is one of the most powerful things the South Carolina governor has. Beyond that, not really sure. All right, moving on to Jermaine Johnson. I really appreciated a lot of what he said. And I think that this is important why we have a bipartisan government, because we need checks and balances ultimately. And ultimately, if you're not familiar with the state of South Carolina, most of the Democrats in the state are not progressive. Most of them are pretty moderate. And that's just a result of how conservative the state of South Carolina is as a whole. We don't have much room politically for super duper progressive politicians. So most of them, once they get to the stage where they're a potential governor, are pretty moderate. And most of the talking points from Mr. Johnson were pretty moderate. So one thing I really appreciate is that he felt like the state of South Carolina, and I fully agree with him right now, is focused on a bunch of boogeymen that don't exist. And instead, there needs to be a focus on crime, mental health, and infrastructure. I think he hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of boogeymen out there that are being focused in the state house, but also you look at county and local levels as well. With regard to infrastructure, he wants to offload roads from the Department of Transportation to municipalities and counties that are more familiar with those roads, that are more capable of handling them, et cetera, et cetera. I think that that's a fantastic idea, personally. Now, we have to obviously make sure that the counties and municipalities can afford to be able to fix these roads themselves. So that's obviously a consideration. But it's clear the DOT is overwhelmed. And, they're backed out about a decade. They would say less time than that, but it's going to end up being a decade for most things. And so this is where, we had that penny sales tax that failed in Greenville County. And one of the things that people didn't like about that penny sales tax was that it did this very thing. It basically had the county taking control of roads that the Department of Transportation is technically responsible for. And the reason for that is the Department of Transportation is probably never going to get to those roads. And so he simply was willing to say the quiet part out loud and just say, yeah, we need to actually do that. How, in terms of them being able to afford that, the counties and cities and unincorporated areas gave no specifics on that. Permitting, he said he wants to create an advisory council to try to find inefficiencies and fix permitting issues. Again, not a lot of specifics. Hard to say whether that would actually go anywhere, but that's his idea there. With regard to insurance, he sits on our state insurance committee, and he is of the belief that that the government is going to have to force insurance companies to bring the rates down. Now, that is an interesting proposal, right? Basically take it away from the free market, but he believes that insurance companies are extorting both homeowners and car owners. And maybe he's right. I haven't done a ton of research into that. But I have been saying for a while that I thought, and I've said multiple times in the show, that perhaps the state of South Carolina at some point will feel the need to step in and create basically a public option for insurance, particularly on auto and homeowners insurance. And that is exactly what his proposal was. So I anticipated this becoming a talking point. Now it's currently a Democrat talking point. Interesting to see if this would ever become a Republican talking point, because obviously public options when it comes to insurance tend to not be something that Republicans want. But that was his solution for bringing down insurance costs. Is generally speaking, again, the fact that I said that the state might start exploring this doesn't mean that I'm in favor of it. But it's interesting to hear that now that's becoming a mainstream talking point. He talked a lot about the property tax crisis, and he wants to eliminate what's called Act 388. Look that up, but that was basically something that happened 2 governors ago that essentially shifted the property tax code where more of the burden of property taxes were placed on landlords versus owner-occupants, and then the sales tax in our state was increased. This was the only bipartisan agreement that we had in this forum. Basically everyone, the lieutenant governor didn't mention Act 388 from what I remember, but basically everyone else said that they are against it. and for different reasons. With regard to affordability, he doesn't have a lot of ideas with regard to that. He mentioned giving counties assistance to help homeowners with down payments, etc. I'm not really sure how you do that. He talked about short-term rentals. He wants the counties to have as much control of that as possible, but to limit institutional investors, which is interestingly a Trump talking point right now. And so I like the idea of giving counties as much power for the most part. However, we do need to solve the issue of, like, if one county bans short-term rentals, that's a private property issue. And then if you've got multiple counties that have all sorts of different restrictions, it's very non-intuitive to most people when they're crossing from one county to the next. And that arbitrary line when you're crossing from one county to the next might be the difference between whether you can have an Airbnb or not. And so I have mixed feelings on that. He talked about data centers. I thought this was interesting. He wants there to be a state moratorium on data centers. And he believes that data centers, they need to figure out how to produce their own electricity, how to build their own infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a populist kind of talking point. Again, I'm not sure that any of that would ever happen. But as a populist talking point, people are going to hear that and like it. Moving on to number 3, Ralph Norman, current U.S. Congressman. He had some of the most, he and Jermaine Johnson had some of the most specifics of everyone here. And not surprising, they're both, experienced politicians. And they can both run as change candidates, unlike Lieutenant Governor Yvette. So Ralph Norman, he immediately started with rattling off he wants to correct waste, fraud, and abuse, stop growing the government. He talked about having a Department of Government Efficiency Commission. Not really sure that DOGE, abbreviated, not sure that's something that people are going to want to hear about again after, all the DOGE stuff last year. But nonetheless, that's one of his talking points. Big on term limits. He wants there to be a term limit bill in our state. I believe that we should do that as well. Talked a lot about tort reform. And this is one of the issues that we have with insurance. And specifically, he said that currently trial lawyers in our state are picking the judges in our state, and he believes that that's a conflict of interest. I would agree with him on that. Regarding roads and bridges, he says we're going to fix them. Not a whole lot of specifics there. Educational standards is something he wants to focus on. Basically that was how he started. Now, with regard to housing affordability and inventory shortages, he wants to put people on the planning commission who have common sense, and don't just regulate developers into oblivion without actually seeing the big picture. He wanted to talk to, actually get builders and developers into his office if he were governor, and actually talk to them directly and figure out, okay, what are the regulations that are just fluff? What things do we need to just make go away? With regard to infrastructure, he was mostly focused on finding the waste, fraud, and abuse in the budget and redirecting that towards roads and bridges. Not sure that that's going to get it done, but that was his talking point. Insurance. He, again, talked about the appointment of judges. He's focused heavily on the fact that insurance companies are simply having to settle frivolous lawsuits because it's too expensive to fight it. And then that ends up, because they're essentially, when you settle a lawsuit, if it's a frivolous lawsuit, you're losing. If it's a lawsuit you should have won, but you're not even going to fight it because it's too expensive to fight it, you lost it. And then that increases the cost of insurance. So he rightly identifies that that's something that we need to fix that. And he mentioned that South Carolina is one of only 2 states to let trial lawyers pick judges. That's really bad. Yeah, we definitely need to stop that. He talked about repealing Act 388. Specifically, he wants income and property taxes to come down, and make sure that we do a forensic accounting of our state government to make sure that we know where all of our money is accounted for, since that's been an issue recently. With regard to short-term rentals, he he didn't have a lot of specifics. He said he wants people to have private property rights, but also he's in the hotel business, which is interesting. So he said he wants to make sure quality and standards are high so that Airbnbs are not a drag on neighborhoods, but he didn't really elaborate further on that. So that's a little bit, again, that's a little bit of a populist talking point. Like, people talk about short-term rentals being a drag on their neighborhood, but what does that even mean? And how do you easily fix that? It's not easy to fix something like that. You're going to have inspections mandated, government inspections done on Airbnbs. I don't really like that. He didn't suggest that, but I'd like to know exactly how that would happen, what specifics he would do. All right, moving on to number 4, Attorney General Alan Wilson. He focused heavily on the fact that the government doesn't create prosperity, and we shouldn't try to utilize the government in that method or for that. He said the government creates conditions for prosperity, but it's private markets that do that. Similar to how, refs don't play the game, but refs create the environment for a game to be played, referees. And that's what the private sector is. The private sector, the teams actually playing the games. And so in his opinion, when something is wrong in our economy, that's a government problem, not a free market problem, which some people will disagree with him on that. But that's what he said. On permitting, he simply said we're antiquated in our government systems. We need to come up to speed on permitting. With regard to insurance, he focused heavily, and of course, he's the Attorney General, so he knows a bit about lawsuits. He said that construction defect lawsuits need reform. This is an interesting point, that a lot of them are just frivolous lawsuits that people, when a home is built, and then, later it's perceived that there are issues, they just go after the builder, they go after everyone. And he's said he's seen a lot of frivolous lawsuits, and that's just causing the cost of insurance for developers to go up, which then gets passed along to the end buyer. So that's a great point. He was the only one that made that point. He said these lawsuits have gone from 65 a year, loosely speaking, in our state, to 400 a year in more recent years. So that's a huge uptick. And of course, we need to keep developers accountable. But if lawsuits are truly frivolous, those need to go away. He talked about liquor liability as well. We've talked about that on the show. He didn't really have any obvious solutions for that, but is aware that that's an issue. He also wants to repeal Act 388 and replace it with something more fair and equitable. Didn't go into a lot of discussions on that. With regard to affordability, he correctly identified that the demand is there, but the supply isn't. And he believes that we need to focus on counties and building in counties that don't have as much housing in them. So he said 90% of South Carolina citizens live in 50% of South Carolina counties, and that we need to create more opportunity in those other counties. But again, not a whole lot of specifics. I'm not really sure how he would go about doing that. And of course, those other 50% of counties, most of the people in those counties want to keep them undeveloped. And so that could be an unpopular proposal, even if it makes sense on the surface. With regard to short-term rentals, he said the state has a role, but not really anything beyond that. He didn't really go into specifics what that role looks like or how that would work with counties. And with regard to growth, he wants to bring opportunity zones on the state level. That's a federal program. He wants to make that a state level program too, and wants to ensure that we don't lose the character of our communities. Which, of course, with regard to growth, nobody wants us to lose the character of our communities. But at the same time, that argument can mean a lot of different things. People were against Falls Park in Greenville. They were against the bridge, going across the park. And look at what that is now. Like nobody would say, I'd rather have that big old road that went through Falls Park and covered over the falls. I'd rather have that than this awesome single hung suspension bridge, that pedestrian suspension bridge that allows you to walk over and look at these beautiful falls. Nobody says that anymore, but people 25 to 30 years ago were saying that. They were saying we would rather have just a road cut through there that we drive on. People literally said it's a good bridge, why would you get rid of it? And so that's where the character argument does go both ways. That's all I'm going to say about that. All right, so we'll cover this more at some point in the future, most likely. But for now, that's a quick little. If you're curious about what's going on, and if you want kind of a jump start on the primaries for South Carolina governor, it's a big one, right? We've not had a true governor primary in quite some time. And so it was nice to get an inside scoop and see some of these people in person in Columbia last week. Now, let's pivot to federal. I've got no notes. I'm just doing this offhand, off the top of my head right now. But we have, obviously, a huge thing going on right now where there is the war with Iran, or whatever you want to call it, conflict. To me, it's a war. I don't see how you can not call it a war, even though Congress has not declared war yet. We're functionally using war powers. And this is, I'm just going to cut to the chase. This is not good for real estate. There's nothing positive about this for real estate. Immediately in the aftermath of this war happening, bond yields, which we talk about quite a bit on the show because that impacts directly mortgage rates. Bond yields initially went down, but then what happened is oil prices started to go way up, and then inflation and job data came in, and that was all just kind of like pointing towards the fact that probably more rate cuts are not coming in the future, and perhaps even rate increases might be coming in the future. Nobody wants to hear that. And so then we saw Treasury yields shoot back up, not in a crazy way, to be honest. It was actually, I have been kind of surprised, even as I'm recording this today on March 9th. We've now had a few days where Treasury yields have come down a little bit from their peak. They kind of peaked out around 4.15, at least end of day on the 5th. That's where they were at. And then they have come down, as I'm recording this, they're 4.125. And, the real estate market that can withstand, if those Treasury yields don't go up tremendously higher than that, the real estate market can withstand that. Because what that's done with regard to mortgage rates is that's caused the 30-year fixed rate mortgage to go from, I told you guys it was down around 5.99. It's now gone back up in the past week or so to currently sitting at 6.17 per Mortgage News Daily. And so that's not great from the standpoint of the housing market, but it's also not terrible. Now, if we saw rates go over, I think probably like 6.3, that could be bad, right? I really want to see these rates below 6.3. Otherwise, we could really start to see the market contract in a way that would be negative for both buyers and sellers. So we don't want that. But we've got unemployment ticked up 4.4%. Not great. Inflation is picking up and projected to pick up even more because now the cost of oil and gasoline is going to go up. That's going to cause inflation to go up as well. Is it, quote unquote, transitory inflation? Maybe, but maybe not as well. We've learned that transitory is not exactly what, it doesn't mean exactly what people have said it's going to mean. And really the main concern here is how long is this conflict going to drag on? Because again, if this was just, going to be a week or two, really, I wouldn't even be talking about this. But there's a lot of projections out there, and even the president himself has said it. Israel has said similar things, that this is going to be a multi-month conflict potentially. And we don't know exactly what that's going to do. But if we see the cost of gasoline just really skyrocket, and it's gone up quite a bit the past few days, but it still hasn't reached the level that it did when Russia invaded Ukraine. But in theory, this should actually have much more impact on the flow of oil and gasoline than the Ukrainian conflict. And so I'm not sure if it's being priced in as much as it should. And so that's where I am concerned about. If traders are just kind of assuming that all is going to be okay, but all is not going to be okay, we could very quickly see treasury yields go way up. We could see mortgage rates go way up. We could see mortgage rates go up because of, not just because of treasury yields or Federal Reserve decisions causing it to go up. We could see, the spread between the 10-year yield and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage widen. It has shrunk in recent months. We've talked extensively about that. That's been the main reason why mortgage rates have come down. If the spread between the 10-year treasury and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage was what it was just a few years ago, rates would be in the mid 7s right now, as it is they're in the low 6s. And so we're all very grateful for that. We don't need the mid 7s. That would be awful for real estate around here in particular. But long story short, there's just a lot of global uncertainty right now, and that is not good for real estate anywhere in the country, but in particular in Greenville, where affordability is so much of a part of this market, that, if rates start to go up, that's going to really be a drag on the spring and summer selling and even buying season, right? Because, even from a buyer standpoint, if sellers decide they're not going to list their home because they don't like, the environment for whatever reason, they're concerned about the economy, they're concerned about the global unrest, all of that, then that means less supply for buyers to potentially be able to purchase. So there's a lot to consider with regard to all of that. And I'm certainly no expert on any of this, but I am watching all the markets and seeing what all happens. And right now there's not a lot of optimism. Let me say it that way. You look at people that study the economy, that focus on real estate in general, not a ton of optimism with regard to how this war is going to affect things. And so really what we all hope for ultimately here is that war gets wrapped up very quickly, most importantly, in order to save lives, but then secondarily so that we can obviously not have disruption in every aspect of our lives here in the U.S. from the standpoint of how this disrupts the economy. So a lot to cover there, and I hope that conflict ends quickly, that we get a nice ceasefire, and that we have peace in that area would be really nice, because it's chaos right now. I had no idea. As a complete side note, it shocked me that Iran has been attacking Persian Gulf countries. That I understand the play on their part. They're trying to turn the Persian Gulf against Israel and the U.S. But it's very interesting. There's a lot of interesting things. Apparently, backdoor deals between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I never would have anticipated that. So it's crazy times right now. Crazy times, and nobody knows what is next. But I'm hoping, again, the one thing that I'm hoping is, because it's a midterm year, Republicans are going to want all of these things to be wrapped up this year. Right? This is the worst thing. If you're a Republican running for office this year, this is the worst thing for you, because it's unpopular with both parties. Neither party wants a new war in terms of voters. And it's causing inflation to go up. It's causing, and listen, the price of gas is known as a single issue that swings elections. And it's a crazy thing, but people know when they go to the pump, a lot of people measure how the economy is doing by how much it costs to fill up their tank. Is that a simple way of assessing it by those people? Yeah, obviously. That's a very simplistic way of doing it. But that's the way people think. And so you've got gas prices taking off. Republicans are not going to be happy about that. Democrats are going to use this all day, every day, for as long as they can, if this bleeds into the midterms. So that's the one thing that I'm hoping, is that there's some checks and balances built in on the basis of that this is a midterm year. But not a clear off-ramp from what I can see from, ending this conflict at the moment. But I'm just a realtor, so who knows? I have no idea what I'm talking about when it comes to global conflicts. I just have a platform and I just pontificate on here. So hope you guys appreciated that. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. We'll certainly be covering not so much the war in Iran. I'm not going to be covering that unless there's some trickle down effects with regard to real estate. But with regard to what's happening in our state, that will certainly have a direct impact on our local real estate, and the governor's race and all of that definitely impacts us. So stay tuned. I hope to provide for you guys more content because I track this stuff very closely, and there will be a lot more here in the future. Although it'll probably be quiet for a bit, right? Because the midterms I think are in June. And so this isn't something I'm going to be covering every week or every month or anything like that, but just as the need arises, I will. So thank you guys so much for listening. Please like, rate, review, subscribe, and go to the show notes if you need a realtor in the Greenville area. And we will talk again next time.